The year was 1605, and the great halls of Europe carried more than the sound of music or prayer. Beneath the shining banquets, beneath the holy hymns, there was another sound, faint and fragile, like a whisper pressed through the cracks of stone. It was said that in certain courts one could hear the soft echoes of voices that no longer belonged to the living. No one spoke of it aloud, but the silence itself had become an instrument of power. Those who ruled had discovered that fear did not always need the roar of the pyre or the scream of the rack. Sometimes it only needed absence, the deliberate removal of something as natural as the human voice. King James of England demanded loyalty, but he demanded it through confession, through the stripping away of secrets that threatened his throne. Across the continent, Emperor Rudolph II obsessed over whispers of treason and heresy, terrified that betrayal lived inside the very walls of his palace. Both men shared the same hunger, not only to hear the truth but to own silence. And so the courts filled with spies, clerics, and doctors who promised new ways of extracting what couldn't be said in public. Among them were men who did not appear cruel, men who wore the mask of science and learning, yet carried in their hands methods that cut deeper than the blade. It began quietly. Servants vanished from the great houses, their absence explained away by drunkenness or dismissal. When they returned, their mouths trembled without sound. Some had wounds stitched into their throats, others bore scars hidden by linen collars. The lords did not ask, and the maids did not confess. Their silence became a living reminder that the walls had ears and the air itself could betray. In banquets, when music filled the hall, these broken figures stood with trays, their eyes lowered, their lips moving without voice. Their presence was enough to still laughter, enough to remind every guest that words were dangerous gifts. The idea spread like a sickness. If loyalty could not be earned, it would be engineered. In Prague, Rudolph's advisors whispered of a chamber built not for chains or fire, but for silence. Its walls were said to magnify every whisper until it became unbearable, a prison of sound that turned the smallest secret into a weapon against its owner. The victim was not beaten. They were made to hear themselves, their voice returned and twisted, until madness opened the door to confession. In England, rumors reached the court of a physician who claimed he could cure disobedience by cutting the voice from the unfaithful, leaving them alive but emptied, useful but broken. At first, many dismissed the tales as exaggeration, the dark gossip of fearful servants. Yet the evidence could not be denied. In letters exchanged between nobles, there were quiet reports of courtiers who had sung at feasts one month and returned silent the next. Musicians who could no longer produce a note. Confessors who sat in chapels unable to whisper a prayer. The silence became heavier than death itself, for the dead were buried, but the voiceless remained, shadows among the living, testaments to a punishment no one dared describe. The silence was not simply punishment, it was design. It carved itself into the heart of the court, shaping behavior more effectively than blood or fire. Every man who held a title, every woman who served near power felt the weight of their own tongue, knowing it could betray them, knowing it could be taken. Fear spread without spectacle because it was hidden in plain sight. The king did not need public executions, he only needed the silent faces moving quietly among his guests. And yet behind this calculated terror there was a single mind that delighted in it more than all others. A physician who studied the human body not for healing but for control. To him, the voice was not a gift from God, but a thread to be cut, reshaped, and silenced. Where others saw cruelty, he saw art. Where others saw sin, he saw order. He knew that a world where no one dared to speak was a world already conquered. By the time the courts began to suspect the truth, the silence had already sunk into them. It lingered in the corridors after every feast, in the chapels after every prayer, in the chambers where servants dared not breathe too loudly. It was not only the silence of fear, but the silence of a new kind of power, one that stripped the soul without spilling blood. The whisper room was not yet spoken of by name, but its shadow was already falling across Europe, and those who entered it would never speak again. Erasmus von Kessler arrived in Prague with the quiet dignity of a man devoted to science. He wore the long black coat of a physician, his hands always gloved, his books bound in leather and marked with symbols that seemed both holy and unholy. To the emperor, he was a man of learning, a doctor who promised to combine medicine and faith in service of the crown. To the clergy, he was a curiosity, for he quoted scripture as often as he described anatomy. And to the servants who carried his chests into the palace, he was something darker, for the crates gave off a smell that was not of herbs, but of iron and rot. He had studied in Italy, where surgeons cut open the bodies of criminals in public squares. He had walked among the alchemists of the Holy Roman Court, who whispered of metals that could heal the mind. He had written papers on the anatomy of the throat, papers that praised not the gift of speech, but the silence that followed its destruction. In his view, the human voice was not sacred. It was dangerous, weak, corruptible. He believed the voice was the root of treason, the door through which blasphemy escaped. To him, the cure for disloyalty was not persuasion or confession, but the precise mutilation of the organs that carried sound. At banquets, he sat with nobles and charmed them with talk of stars and humors. He laughed gently at their jokes, raised his cup at the king's health, and offered advice when sickness spread through the court. Yet beneath this mask, he kept notebooks filled with diagrams of throats cut open, tongues dissected, and vocal cords stretched over wooden frames. He did not write of curing illness. He wrote of harnessing silence, of shaping men and women into living symbols of obedience. Where others saw punishment as crude, he saw in it a kind of ritual perfection. It began with the servants, for they were the least protected. A boy accused of whispering secrets in the stables was sent to Erasmus's chamber. He emerged 3 days later, his mouth stitched shut not with thread, but with strips of horse sinew soaked in vinegar. The sinew contracted as it dried, pulling his lips into a permanent grimace, and when at last the stitches were cut away, he could no longer open his jaw. He wandered the halls with his eyes wide, groaning softly through his teeth, a reminder that gossip had a price. Then came a maid, accused of mocking a nobleman in the kitchens. Erasmus took her into his chamber and returned her with a tongue blackened and split by drops of distilled mercury. The poison had not killed her, but it had hardened the flesh, twisting it into a dead weight that made speech impossible. She wept in the corners of the palace, pointing at her mouth, while Erasmus explained calmly to the court that she had been healed of disobedience. The emperor was pleased. He called Erasmus not a butcher, but a savior of loyalty. King James, hearing of these methods through his envoys, wrote letters of praise and hinted that Erasmus should visit England. Erasmus accepted with the modest smile of a scholar, yet inside he carried the quiet hunger of a man whose power had finally been recognized. The killings that followed were not quick executions, but prolonged lessons. A guard who spoke ill of the emperor was taken. Erasmus opened his throat with surgical precision, not to kill, but to insert a hollow reed carved from ash wood. The man lived, but every breath he took whistled through the reed like a broken flute. He could not speak, but he could not die either. He became an instrument of his own punishment, a breathing relic of the doctor's work. Erasmus believed these acts were not cruelty but purification. He compared himself to the priests who burned incense, to the scribes who cleansed scripture of error. In his eyes, he was removing corruption at its root, cutting the disease of treason from the body of the court. He prayed before each procedure, whispering psalms as his knife moved, convincing himself that God had chosen him to silence the unfaithful. The court grew quieter, laughter at feasts faded, songs in the chapel faltered, servants trembled at the sound of their own words, afraid that the wrong phrase might deliver them into the doctor's hands. And Erasmus, watching this silence spread, felt not guilt but triumph. To him, each mutilated voice was proof that the world was moving toward order, proof that silence could be stronger than fear itself. And so the physician, hidden behind his mask of learning and faith, became the architect of silence. He was not the executioner who spilled blood in the square, nor the inquisitor who shouted for confessions. He was the quiet man in the corner of the banquet, the gentle doctor with careful hands who carried within him a mind that believed evil could be made holy if it was performed in silence. The whisper room was not yet spoken of, but already Erasmus's methods had laid its foundation brick by brick, throat by throat. The chamber was not marked by iron or bloodstains, nor by the fetid air of a common prison. Its door, carved from dark oak, fit so tightly into the stone that it appeared to be part of the wall itself. Inside, the room was modest in size, yet every surface had been shaped with obsessive intent. Wooden panels lined the walls, each cut at a precise angle to capture and amplify the faintest sound. Narrow slits, barely noticeable, ran along the floor and ceiling, channels designed to carry whispers from one corner to the next, ensuring that no murmur would escape unrecorded. Erasmus von Kessler called it a space for therapy, a method for rooting out disloyalty, but those who entered soon discovered it was a crucible of fear that stripped the soul raw. The first who were brought there were servants accused of minor betrayals, a stolen coin, a whispered joke about a noble, a prayer deemed improper. Once inside, they were forced to speak. At first, the sounds were simple, hesitant like the tremor of a frightened bird. But the chamber transformed each whisper into a blade. The acoustics magnified every syllable, returned it tenfold, 20-fold, until the captive could hear themselves speaking over and over, each repetition tearing at the edges of sanity. There were no chains to bind the body, but the mind became imprisoned, cornered by a voice it could no longer control. Some begged silently, their eyes darting to the walls as if pleading with the wood itself to stop, while others began to hum or chant, desperate to mask the echo of their own words. Erasmus observed from a small alcove, concealed behind a panel of darkened glass, recording the reactions in meticulous notebooks. He noted the quiver of a lip, the sudden halt of a breath, the shaking of a hand. To him, each reaction was data, a sign of progress. He did not see suffering. He saw the human will bending to his design. Those who lasted longer were subjected to additional refinements. A reed carved from black ash and inserted into the mouth forced the lips into a permanent curl, distorting vowels and consonants until speech became a cruel mockery of itself. Others had their tongues lightly seared with heated metal rods, producing involuntary sounds that fed the chamber's echo, forcing the mind to struggle against noise that had no origin outside their own pain. The room claimed more than sanity. It claimed identity. A young maid, brought for laughing at a minor mishap in the kitchen, was made to whisper her prayers for an hour. Her words returned amplified, harsh, ricocheting off the walls until her knees buckled. She could feel the vibrations traveling into her bones, shivering through her skull. When Erasmus finally removed her, she could not form normal speech, could not summon the comfort of a simple word. She walked silently through the palace, a living testament to the doctor's method, her eyes hollow, her hands trembling. She was neither dead nor free. She was the embodiment of obedience sculpted through terror. Some of the more extreme cases involved devices that pushed the chamber beyond sound alone. A pulley system could tilt the floor ever so slightly, forcing a captive to strain constantly against gravity while their echoes grew louder. Another mechanism allowed a small bell to chime whenever a sound was made, turning even involuntary breaths into instruments of torment. Erasmus believed that the physical discomfort amplified the psychological collapse, that mind and body could not be separated when crafting perfect silence. He prided himself on creating an environment where every sense was manipulated, every instinct weaponized, and every word a trap. The chamber was methodical, deliberate, almost clinical in its cruelty. Unlike a pyre or a guillotine, it did not kill quickly. It reshaped the human spirit one whisper at a time. Survivors carried the echo of the room with them even outside its walls. In corridors, in halls, in the quiet of the night, they could still hear the chamber's resonance within their skulls. A reminder that disloyalty could not be hidden, that words themselves could betray. And Erasmus, the unseen architect of this terror, moved silently through the palace, smiling as he watched his invisible dominion grow, knowing that the whispers were no longer theirs alone. They belonged to him, and to the chamber he had created. No one left unchanged. Nobles began to measure their words carefully. Servants spoke only when necessary, and the court itself seemed to breathe differently, as if anticipating the echo of a wrong phrase. Silence had become its own law, its own threat, and at the center of it, Erasmus felt a grim satisfaction. The chamber was not just a room, it was a proof, a stage where obedience could be enforced without spectacle, where fear became invisible, unassailable, and inescapable. By the time whispers were carried beyond the palace walls, the method of silence had already begun to spread, seeding terror that would echo long after Erasmus had left the chamber behind. The first to enter the chamber were ordinary people, unnoticed until they vanished. Servants in silks and wool, children of the court whose voices carried gossip, whose curiosity was considered too sharp for their place, were summoned quietly under the guise of routine inspection or medical examination. No one noticed their absence immediately. The whispers began in the hallways in fragments, a name spoken too long, a rumor repeated in shadow, and then they were gone, swallowed into Erasmus' silent theater, leaving behind only the dread of what had become of them. A young maid, barely 16, was brought in for murmuring about a lord's indulgences. Erasmus observed her with clinical detachment as she was seated on a small bench at the center of the chamber. She had not understood the room's purpose at first, thinking it some strange test of obedience. But the moment she began to whisper, the walls seized her words. Each syllable returned tenfold, reverberating through her head until her thoughts split apart, fracturing under the sound of her own voice. Erasmus' hands were steady and deliberate as he worked. With tools forged for precision, he carved her tongue into a spiral, a grotesque coil of flesh designed to make speech impossible. The process was excruciating, prolonged just enough to ensure that the terror of the sound, the echo of her own voice magnified by the chamber, was fully absorbed into her mind. When she finally left, her lips could no longer form words, and her eyes reflected the deep, permanent isolation of someone who had been erased from conversation entirely. The second victim was a noble boy, son of a minor duke, brought for the suspicion of sly remarks in a card game. He was pale but confident, accustomed to being watched and praised, unaware that the same observant gaze could be bent toward destruction. Erasmus manipulated the boy's larynx with the same cold fascination as he did the tongue of the maid, reshaping it so that each inhale and exhale produced a shrill, unnatural whistle. The boy's first moments outside the chamber were grotesque. His cries for help came as piercing, unintelligible tones, making those around recoil in horror. And yet the chamber had taught him something beyond fear. It taught submission. Each whistle was a confession, a testimony to the control of another over his very breath. His body had become a ledger of obedience, a monument to terror inscribed in living flesh. No detail was left to chance. Erasmus believed that mutilation should speak of loyalty, that the body itself must confess the nature of treachery it had once concealed. Each wound was symbolic, a spiral tongue for the endless twisting of rumors, a whistling larynx for the betrayed voice of a noble. In his notebooks, he documented reactions with obsessive care. The way the girl's knees trembled, the way the boy's hands shook, the subtle way their minds folded inward as they internalized the impossibility of escape. These were not quick punishments, not fleeting spectacles designed to horrify observers. They were methodical, ritualistic. The suffering was a slow, deliberate collapse of self, crafted to imprint fear permanently on anyone who might witness or hear of it. By the time the first maid stumbled back into the corridors of the palace, her silence had already begun to ripple through the court. Servants who had witnessed her disappearance whispered about the transformation they could not understand. Nobles watched the boy struggle with his unnatural breath, caught between disbelief and unease. The effect of the chamber extended beyond its walls. Fear had become a physical presence, a weight pressing into every word spoken and every gesture made in the palace. Erasmus, unseen, observed each response with satisfaction, knowing the terror would multiply without additional effort. It was in this early phase that the true psychological power of the chamber became apparent. The victims themselves were not only deformed, they were altered in spirit. They carried their punishments everywhere, walking monuments to Erasmus' meticulous cruelty. The maid could not form words, yet she spoke volumes through posture, through hesitation, through the empty pleading in her gaze. The boy could breathe, but only in shrill whistles, each exhale a reminder that the body had betrayed him, and by extension any who might disobey the invisible hand of authority. Thus the first unrecorded victims were not merely punished. They were transformed into instruments of dread. Erasmus had proven that silence could be extracted through precision, that the body could confess, and that horror could spread without a single raised hand outside the chamber. Fear, once ignited, moved like a ghost through the halls of power, touching all who heard, all who observed, and all who imagined themselves next. The stage was set, and the whisper room had found its first testimony, methodical, symbolic, and indelibly cruel. Erasmus von Kessler's obsession deepened as the whisper room proved its effectiveness. The initial victims had demonstrated what terror could do when extracted methodically from flesh and amplified through the mind, but he sought permanence. Silence alone was insufficient. He needed mastery over the body itself, a way to ensure that voices could be removed without ending life, so that the punishment could linger visible and unbearable like a moral lesson cast in flesh. In secret chambers beneath his quarters, he began to record the procedures in manuscripts bound in blackened vellum, blending anatomy with alchemical theory and scripture. Each page was meticulous, containing diagrams of the throat, tongue, and jaw, notes on tinctures and corrosive agents, and citations from obscure texts to cloak his methods in intellectual and spiritual legitimacy. He called the practice the ritual of unvoicing, a phrase meant to elevate cruelty to a kind of sacred craft. Erasmus believed that the mouth was the vessel of loyalty, that every whisper held potential treachery, and that controlling speech was akin to controlling the soul. The techniques he devised were slow, precise, and entirely devastating. Mercury-coated threads were used to split vocal cords, a process that required patience as the metal infused itself into the tissue, rendering the cords stiff and cracked, allowing breathing and swallowing but making speech jagged, metallic, and grotesque. Each incision and burn was measured against both anatomy and psychological effect. He noted in his journals the subtle terror in a victim's eyes as they realized they would never form words the same way again, the moment when comprehension dawned that sound itself could betray them. Another method involved horsehair, finely twisted and soaked in tinctures of sulfur and arsenic. Erasmus would bind the tongues of the unsuspecting with the hair, forcing it deep into the tissue so that it would fester over weeks. Victims were given food and water, their bodies sustained while their mouths became instruments of decay. Each act was performed with hands that were careful, almost loving in their precision, as though he were tending a rare specimen rather than torturing a human being. The slow corruption of flesh produced a terror that could not be unlearned. The victim's every attempt to speak, to complain, to assert self, met only with the acid taste of infection and the impossibility of expression. He also devised heated iron molds pressed against the throat and jaw. The device was designed to destroy the superficial tissues responsible for articulation while leaving the deeper structures intact, so that the victim could eat, swallow, and breathe but could no longer form consonants or vowels. The smell of burned flesh mixed with the faint tang of medicinal oils as Erasmus worked. The sound of a voice transformed into a grotesque parody of speech, a croaking, sputtering echo of what had once been human. The ritual was complete when he intoned a passage from the Psalms over the subject, lending a false sanctity to mutilation, as if God himself had sanctioned the destruction of disloyal tongues. Each of these acts was calculated to terrorize not only the immediate victim but all who might hear or witness the aftermath. Servants whispered about the girl who could only hiss, the nobleman whose words sounded like shrill bells, each instance a cautionary tale. The chamber became a laboratory for sound itself, a place where Erasmus tested the boundaries of human endurance, patience, and comprehension. No scream was wasted, every response recorded and catalogued. The manuscripts contained his observations, the way panic set into the muscles of the face, the creeping despair of someone unable to summon a syllable, the hollow defeat that followed. In his mind, these rituals were as sacred as scripture. He wrote that silence was the only true confession, and that the body must bear the evidence of inner thought. There was a ritualistic component to everything, the order in which procedures were performed, the alignment of instruments along the victim's body, the precise chant of phrases borrowed from liturgical texts. Even his assistants, carefully vetted and sworn to secrecy, became part of this choreography, learning to anticipate each movement, to hand him the correct instrument at the right moment, to witness the collapse of a human mind without flinching. The psychological toll extended beyond the chamber, embedding a fear that spread silently among the staff, a network of tension and watchfulness. By the end of each day, Erasmus would step back and observe, noting not just the physical outcome but the alteration of the psyche. He was methodical in the way a sculptor is, shaping despair, molding submission, refining terror into art. The victims, once full of speech and expression, became living monuments to control, each body a testament to what could be done when cruelty was measured, repeated, and elevated to ritual. And through this, Erasmus cemented his philosophy: that evil need not be loud to dominate, that silence imposed deliberately and beautifully could speak louder than any scream, and that the mind, once reshaped by terror, would carry the memory of its own mutilation for a lifetime. The ritual of unvoicing was no longer an experiment. It had become a doctrine. Erasmus knew that those who entered the chamber would emerge transformed, their voices gone but their terror lingering, a ripple that would infect the court itself. He had created a system in which punishment, symbolism, and superstition intertwined, a web of psychological oppression from which there could be no retreat. The chamber was no longer merely a room. It was an oracle of dread, and every whispered report of a mutilated tongue reinforced the invisible dominion of the man who had learned to speak through the silence of others. The whispers of Erasmus von Kessler's work in the shadows had grown too potent to remain contained among servants and minor functionaries. Rumors of disloyalty, of conspiracies both real and imagined, reached the ears of Emperor Rudolph II, who, gripped by suspicion and the fever of courtly intrigue, became a willing instrument of the doctor's design. Erasmus approached the emperor with a careful mixture of science and ritual, presenting his methods as a necessary purification of loyalty. Dukes, courtiers, and even high-ranking clergy were marked as examples, their compliance, or lack thereof, measured not merely by obedience, but by the grotesque precision of their suffering. The whisper cure became both spectacle and admonition, a system in which fear itself was a weapon refined to exactitude. Banquets, once designed for the pomp and vanity of noble life, became arenas for terror. Erasmus attended these dinners with instruments concealed beneath his robes, carrying out alterations to speech that transformed conversation into grotesque mimicry. One nobleman, formerly known for his eloquence and sharp tongue, found himself reduced to a series of breathy whistles, his words spilling like broken bells across the marble floors. Courtiers froze, wine tumbling from hands, eyes wide as the sound of human speech became uncanny and unfamiliar. The methodical cruelty was deliberate, each modification of throat and tongue conducted with a precision that allowed life to continue while stripping dignity and control. Every affected noble was returned to the public, their mutilation both visible and audible, a living warning that no one, even those closest to the throne, was immune. The psychological calculus of Erasmus was meticulous. He observed the faces of the untouched, noting the tremor of a hand, the quickened heartbeat, the avoidance of eye contact. The presence of mutilated nobility at the same table transformed power into dread. Every glance at the malformed voices of peers reinforced obedience and submission. Silence became the language of survival, and the echo of what had once been a rich vocabulary haunted the corridors of the palace. Erasmus recorded each reaction, cataloging the subtle terror in those who had escaped mutilation, recognizing the ripples of fear as extensions of his own control. In this manner, the doctor not only punished but reshaped the court's collective psyche, molding behavior through anticipation of unspeakable consequences. Among the most haunting cases was that of Anna of Tyrol, a woman renowned for her devotion and musical gifts, whose voice had once lifted hymns so that even the sternest prelate paused to listen. Erasmus insisted on her examination, claiming to uncover whispers of disloyalty, and in a private chamber beneath the cathedral, he executed a ritual of unvoicing unlike any before. Heated irons, mercury threads, and horsehair, each instrument and technique applied with deliberate slowness, transformed her vocal cords into instruments of silence. She was returned to court appearing unharmed, yet her voice, her most intimate expression of faith and identity, had been stolen. The absence of her song at Mass, the hollow echo of her prayers, became an unspoken accusation, a constant reminder of the hidden terror ruling over court and conscience alike. The aftermath was devastating not only for Anna but for all who witnessed the results. Clergy murmured prayers for souls, doubting both their safety and their salvation, while courtiers and guests watched the subtle gestures that had replaced speech. A tilt of the head, the raise of a hand, a whispered note to a confidant, all laden with the oppressive weight of potential ruin. Fear spread invisibly yet palpably, like a disease of the spirit. Erasmus observed, detached yet enraptured, the methodical expansion of his influence through terror. Each mutilation was both punishment and pedagogy, a silent sermon of obedience delivered through flesh, voice, and the ever-present possibility of repetition. The doctor's mind embraced this theater of control with clinical devotion, He measured not only anatomy but emotion, timing each procedure to maximize dread. The psychological toll on victims was compounded by the exposure to public life. They could neither conceal their mutilation nor escape the scrutiny of those who understood the implications of their altered bodies. The court became a stage in which silence, methodically inflicted, became more commanding than any decree. Obedience was no longer a matter of law or loyalty alone. It was enforced by the persistent, unyielding presence of horror made corporeal. Through these acts, Erasmus cemented a doctrine that blurred science, ritual, and supernatural authority. Punishment, he believed, should be visible, irreversible, and unforgettable. The nobility, once assured of their privilege, now walked with the shadow of mutilation over their voices. Their every gesture and whispered thought weighed against the unseen instruments and unseen hands capable of transforming life into ritualized terror. The emperor, convinced of the righteousness of these measures, became both patron and victim of this logic, extending Erasmus's reach while reinforcing the psychological dominion the doctor had meticulously constructed. By the end of the season, the court had fallen silent, not merely in words, but in spirit. Even the boldest conversations were curtailed, gestures muted, laughter tempered with apprehension. The terror imposed through ritualized mutilation became a language everyone understood. Erasmus, observing this transformation, recorded in his manuscripts with deliberate care. Silence could be made sacred, obedience sculpted through pain, and the human mind reshaped to revere fear itself. He had converted cruelty into a systemic art, a structure of dominance in which the nobility, once untouchable, were now living monuments to methodical horror. The chamber, perfected through Erasmus von Kessler's relentless obsession, was no longer merely a tool for the living. It had become a mausoleum of sound, a place where death itself was curated and orchestrated with the same precision he had applied to mutilation. Not all who entered survived the rituals designed to purify loyalty or punish betrayal. Some were left to starve, their bodies wasting slowly, each heartbeat marking time in a rhythm the doctor had calculated for maximum psychological resonance. Yet even in the surrender to death, Erasmus found opportunity. He had constructed instruments unlike any known to science or scripture, devices that would record, translate, and preserve the final articulations of the condemned. Hollow reeds were threaded delicately into windpipes, copper and brass spirals pressed to vocal cords in a manner that captured sound after life had left it. Human throats were transformed into organ pipes, the labored breathing of the dying converted into music, a grotesque symphony of suffering. These instruments, bound together in what he referred to in his journals as a choir of silence, turned the gasps, murmurs, and whispered pleas of the dying into an endless echo, a haunting composition that resided in the walls themselves. Erasmus observed his creations with a clinical detachment that concealed his fascination. He recorded not only the sounds but the precise moment when each soul faltered, noting how hunger and isolation twisted the vocal apparatus before death stole it entirely. The chamber became a laboratory of despair, where every death was a variable in his study, each scream or gurgle a data point to be cataloged and analyzed. Those who survived and returned carried the imprint of these horrors in their minds. The whispered last confessions of neighbors, the stifled cries of distant victims, the way terror, once mechanically imposed, could propagate into hallucination. Visitors to the chamber often reported hearing voices that were impossibly familiar, fragments of words they had never spoken but felt compelled to recognize. Some claimed that Erasmus had succeeded in capturing the very essence of human terror, trapping it in tangible form so that it might haunt the living indefinitely. Among the first experiments in the choir, Erasmus had placed a young maid who had dared gossip into the chamber. Starved and frightened, her body frail with neglect, she was never intended to return. Yet her final whispers, caught in reeds threaded through her windpipe, became the centerpiece of a series of harmonic arrangements. Each time a visitor entered the room, the instrument gave voice to her suffering, an almost musical repetition of the phrases she had never intended to utter aloud. Those who heard the sounds described a disorientation that left the mind unmoored, the human need for closure denied by the mechanical replay of agony. Erasmus watched this effect with a meticulous fascination, noting the widening influence of psychological terror on those unprepared to confront it. The choir was not merely a testament to death, but a doctrine of fear. Courtiers and servants alike were drawn to the chamber under pretense of curiosity or obligation, only to find themselves haunted by the lingering presence of their predecessors. The echoes were insidious. They seemed to follow individuals, transforming the mundane into a stage for torment. Whispers repeated endlessly, variations of betrayal, sorrow, and final pleas, a perpetuation of punishment that transcended the corporeal. Erasmus described these outcomes as lessons in fidelity. The human mind, now subject to repetition, as strict and unforgiving as the mutilations he had perfected. Even those closest to the emperor became aware of the chamber's influence. Rudolph II, initially intrigued by the scientific and ritualistic novelty, found the echoes invasive and disquieting. The whispered voices of the dead, perfectly preserved, made sleep impossible, conversation fraught, and thought perpetually interrupted by a presence that was neither living nor fully absent. Erasmus, unfazed, took notes on the subtle erosion of royal resolve, the way authority itself became tethered to fear rather than decree. He considered the manipulation of perception the ultimate extension of his methods. It was not merely bodies that could be controlled, but the very experience of reality. Erasmus documented the full sequence of death and sound with obsessive precision, creating diagrams in ink and blood that mapped the interactions of voice, throat, and chamber acoustics. He annotated the delay of breath, the cadence of starvation, the subtle micro-vibrations that made each voice unique, a fingerprint of suffering. He believed that by controlling sound after death, he could extend his influence indefinitely, leaving behind an enduring testament to his mastery over life, voice, and mind. In this chamber, the dead became tools, their last breaths instruments in the service of doctrine, their suffering repurposed as art and punishment alike. The psychological toll on visitors was methodical and severe. Courtiers reported dreams where the whispers followed them home, repeating the final murmurs of servants and nobles alike. The repetition bred paranoia, fractured thought, and the desperate need for avoidance that Erasmus had anticipated. Even the most rational minds, subjected to the endless replay of the choir, were manipulated into behaviors of extreme caution, obedience, and preemptive silence. Fear, once imposed externally through mutilation, now became internalized, perpetuating itself long after the hands of the doctor had departed. Through the choir, Erasmus achieved a culmination of his vision. Death transformed into ritual, suffering into instruction, and silence into a living presence. The chamber was no longer merely a space. It had become an organism in which terror was cyclical, extending the reach of the doctor's will beyond life itself. Every breath, every whispered confession, every death meticulously orchestrated, fed the system of control he had perfected, leaving the living to navigate a world haunted by the methodical echoes of the dead. In this way, Erasmus von Kessler ensured that his influence would persist long after the bodies ceased to speak, creating a theater of the morbid where fear itself was immortal. Erasmus's obsession with silence had begun as a tool, a method to enforce obedience, but over time it evolved into a pursuit of perfection, a devouring hunger for control that consumed every boundary of reason. The chamber of whispers had not been enough. Even the choir of the dead, though meticulous in its preservation of terror, could not satiate the craving that twisted his mind into ever more elaborate extremes. Children became his next subjects, those of the servants who whispered too freely, whose laughter or curiosity he deemed dangerous. Their voices were deemed impure, their words unworthy of the sanctity he imagined in silence. Wax molds replaced tongues. The pliable substance pressed into every groove and crevice of the mouth, designed to harden and form an unbroken record of stillness. Erasmus viewed this as an art form, a composition of absence, believing that the human body could be transformed into an instrument of absolute muteness. The process was excruciating, the small bodies trembling, choking, and gagging as the wax was forced deeper and deeper. And yet he observed without interruption, meticulously recording every minute detail, every scream muffled into incomprehensible cadence. Pain was not incidental. It was necessary. It was the medium through which silence could be perfected, and the suffering of the innocent a testament to his genius. Even the court began to feel the ripple of his mania. Rumors surfaced of children wandering the halls, their mouths sealed by cold wax, their wide eyes reflecting a terror that the most loyal servant could not soothe. Mothers wept quietly, fathers grew frantic, yet no one dared confront Erasmus directly. His proximity to the emperor granted him impunity, and yet fear of the unknown, of the methodical cruelty that seemed to bend reality itself, kept the court bound in obedience. It was not until a royal cousin, a young woman whose laughter had been heard singing through the corridors, was discovered with her throat disfigured beyond repair, that the strain of terror became tangible. Her voice, once vibrant, had been transformed into a grotesque whistle, twisted and inhuman, a permanent scar on both body and mind. The horror of her condition ignited outrage, the court whispering accusations that had long been feared: witchcraft, alchemical treachery, unnatural science. Erasmus, ever calculating, did not linger to face judgment. The day before any trial could convene, he vanished. His disappearance was as methodical as his tortures, leaving behind only the tools of his obsession. Wax molds hardened into grotesque shapes, surgical diagrams marked with meticulous annotations, journals filled with calculations of sound and silence, and a chamber that still reeked of burned flesh and human suffering. Each page, each sketch was a testament to a mind that had transcended cruelty, seeking not just control over others but mastery over the very essence of human expression. Investigators who entered the chamber later described the smell of burned skin as a memory embedded in the walls, a physical residue of the horrors that had occurred, so potent it seemed almost to linger in the lungs of anyone who dared to breathe it. The instruments of his craft remained, each one a witness to the methodical extremity of his obsession, a macabre shrine to silence that could never speak but whose presence dominated the air. The psychological toll on the court and servants was immediate and devastating. Mothers whose children had been taken were rendered catatonic. Fathers wandered the halls in a delirium of guilt and terror. Courtiers shunned corridors where whispers once echoed, anticipating that the unvoiced cries of the vanished might linger unseen. Fear, cultivated and amplified by Erasmus, became an invisible architecture, shaping every interaction and every decision. Even after his disappearance, the memory of his rituals haunted the castle. The wax molds, the whistle of mutilated throats, the instruments of dying breath, all remained as reminders that obedience and silence were intertwined with suffering in ways that the human mind could scarcely reconcile. Those who had survived his experiments reported nightmares in which children's mouths filled with wax, in which every attempt at speech was met with unbearable agony, in which the voice itself became a liability, a danger, a weapon against one's own survival. Yet Erasmus had left behind more than terror. He had left behind knowledge codified in diagrams and journals that hinted at procedures even more extreme than those already enacted. Scholars and physicians who dared examine his work were forced to confront the boundaries of morality and reason, realizing that the doctor's pursuit of silence had erased the line between science and sacrilege. Each page invited both fascination and revulsion, a methodical instruction manual for cruelty masquerading as enlightenment. Even the emperor, confronted with the proof of the doctor's genius and madness, was forced to acknowledge the catastrophic scope of what had occurred within the walls of his own court. The chamber, the wax, the organs, the choir of silence, all remained, silent witnesses to a descent into obsession so complete that no one could predict its conclusion or the consequences it would continue to exact on those who lived in its shadow. In the end, the collapse of Erasmus was not violent, not abrupt, but complete in its invisibility. He left no body, no confession, no trace of human frailty. What remained was the echo of methodical destruction, the instruments of silence, the terror etched into minds that would never unlearn it, and a court rendered obedient through fear of what could no longer be seen but could never be forgotten. His disappearance transformed the chamber into a mausoleum, a place where the memory of suffering became a legacy, where silence itself was the final witness to the methodical genius of a mind unbound by morality. The collapse was total, yet the influence endured, etched into wax, flesh, walls, and memory, a macabre testament to the obsessive calculus of a psychopath who had sought to make silence eternal. After Erasmus vanished, the chamber he had meticulously constructed was sealed with layers of stone and mortar, the door bricked over as if the walls themselves could absorb the memories of suffering and silence. The court declared it a closed chapter, an inconvenience best forgotten, and official records erased all mention of its existence. Yet the act of erasure could not contain the resonance of what had occurred within. Servants whispered of sounds that clung to corridors, faint but insistent murmurs that seemed to drift through the castle long after doors were locked. Voices that had never been meant to carry but persisted, curling through the stones like smoke. Each faint murmur reminded them that silence, once pursued with such obsessive precision, could never be fully commanded, that the weight of methodical cruelty had a resonance beyond life, a ghostly echo that fed fear long after the victims had perished. Courts across Europe felt the ripple of this hidden terror. In France, a noblewoman visiting Prague reported hearing faint chants and distant cries in the night, attributing them to madness until others confessed similar experiences. In Bohemia, servants told of hearing children's laughter, warped into hollow whistles, seeping from the walls during late hours, as if Erasmus's work had imprinted itself on the very architecture, inscribing terror into mortar and stone. No one spoke openly of the chamber for fear of invoking its legacy, yet the whispers became a hidden language, a secret acknowledgement that some acts of methodical horror refused to die quietly. The very idea of silence had become a living thing, lurking behind walls and echoing in minds, growing more potent with each recounting. Rumor alone carried the weight of fear, a network of dread extending far beyond the castle where Erasmus had walked, shaping the behavior of servants, courtiers, and nobles who had never even glimpsed the instruments of his cruelty. Across the English Channel, the echoes found a new vessel. A physician, newly appointed to a court of high repute, received a set of manuscripts bound in the deliberate hand of Erasmus, its pages thick with diagrams, annotations, and instructions for continuing the work of unvoicing. The instructions were precise, outlining the placement of threads, the preparation of materials, and the sequence of ritualistic incisions, as though the act of removing the voice itself were a holy practice, a science masquerading as art, and an art designed to assert dominion over flesh and spirit. The manuscripts exhorted secrecy and patience, warning that any misstep would be catastrophic to the mind and body alike. The physician, both horrified and compelled by the meticulous precision of Erasmus's calculations, began experiments in silence, a slow, obsessive reproduction of techniques once performed in Prague. Wax molds, horsehair bindings, mercury threads, and heated iron forms reappeared, hidden from public eyes, clandestine in laboratories that echoed with the faint hum of impossibly controlled terror. In this way, the legacy of Erasmus persisted. Silence became contagious, spreading from stone and paper to flesh and blood, an invisible terror that did not need witnesses to assert its dominion. Even when practitioners worked in secrecy, the psychological toll was evident. Those subjected to these experiments emerged altered, their voices muted or warped, their minds haunted by the methodical pain endured at the hands of hands that prized control above compassion. The physician reported to no one, recorded in no official ledger, yet each act of mutilation carried forward the echo of Erasmus's obsession, extending the reach of his cruelty into new courts, new families, and new victims whose names would never appear in history. Servants who had remained in the original castle, Those who had lived through the chamber's unspoken horrors described the walls as alive. They swore that at night the air vibrated with words that had never been meant to escape, whispers that seemed to accuse and instruct, a spectral instruction manual of cruelty. Their descriptions were fragmented, as though fear itself erased memory, leaving only the sensation of presence, the knowledge that methodical violence leaves a mark far beyond the immediate body. These remnants of terror shaped behavior in subtle but absolute ways. Obedience enforced by unseen forces, conversations curtailed lest voices carry too freely, and a pervasive unspoken acknowledgement that silence could be as damning as any punishment delivered by sight or sword. Even after decades, when the bricked-over chamber had become legend, Erasmus's influence remained. The manuscripts, clandestine experiments, and whispered echoes ensured that silence became a discipline, a ritual, and a weapon passed carefully from hand to hand. The fear of discovery ensured that those who perpetuated it would speak only to the few. Yet the psychological architecture of terror was as complete as the stone walls that held the original chamber. In this way, the Whisper Room, though physically sealed and erased from official history, had become immortal. Its presence endured in the minds of those who remembered, in the hidden acts of science that continued its work, and in the unvoiced screams that echoed, unseen and unstoppable, across courts, lands, and generations. The silence Erasmus had cultivated was not empty. It was methodical, deliberate, and eternal, a haunting testament to a mind whose pursuit of control had transcended death itself. Centuries passed, and the stone walls of the Whisper Room, long sealed and forgotten by official decree, became the seed of legend. The air of Prague and Vienna carried the faintest trace of its past, a presence felt but unspoken, like a chill in the corner of the mind. Scholars and antiquarians debated whether Erasmus had truly existed, or whether the manuscripts, diagrams, and accounts were the fevered imaginings of a singularly cruel mind. Yet across Europe, the whispers persisted, carried in the reticence of courtiers, the hushed tones of servants, and the deliberate silences of physicians who had stumbled upon fragments of Erasmus's work. The horror had become a philosophy, a warning encoded in ritual, and a method of control, one that did not rely on spectacle but on the meticulous engineering of fear. The essence of his work survived not in the bodies he had mutilated, but in the very idea that voices could be stolen without killing, that power could be enforced by absence, and that terror's weight could persist even in the guise of order. In certain asylums where the care of the mind was entrusted to men of learning, Erasmus's influence was suspected to resurface. Patients deemed unruly or inconvenient were silenced rather than healed, their vocal cords bound, tongues pressed, voices muted by methods too precise to be accidental. Scholars argued over whether these acts were the organic evolution of medical practice or a direct inheritance of Erasmus's philosophy, that suffering could be shaped into obedience, and silence could serve as punishment more absolute than any lash or lock. Records were vague, sanitized, and often destroyed, yet hidden notes and private testimonies told of patients whose cries had been stilled by hands following the meticulous instructions of a centuries-old manuscript. The psychological impact was profound. The patients, stripped of speech, became vessels of their own terror, their minds circling endlessly in isolation, haunted by the loss of their voice, unable to articulate fear, pain, or despair. Those entrusted with maintaining them became mirrors of Erasmus himself, meticulously precise in their cruelty, convinced they were serving a higher purpose while the essence of methodical evil quietly endured. In cities like Prague and Vienna, memorial stones began to appear, monuments small and understated, dedicated to the voiceless. Some bore names and dates, others remained anonymous, yet all carried the unspoken weight of Erasmus's legacy. Pilgrims, historians, and the curious who passed by could sense the shadow of cruelty embedded in their polished surfaces, a reminder that methodical suffering leaves traces beyond the flesh, etched into memory and collective consciousness. Debate raged among clergy, scholars, and civic leaders over whether these memorials commemorated real horrors or were the products of myth, yet their presence confirmed a fundamental truth. The lesson of the whisper room persisted. Evil, it seemed, required no witnesses, no proclamation, no scream. It thrived in silence, in obedience, in the slow corrosion of trust and certainty. It whispered, and those who heard it, directly or through the careful imitation of its methods, passed the terror forward without acknowledgement, bound by secrecy and awe. Legal historians traced faint echoes of Erasmus's influence into early reforms against torture, noting paradoxically that his methods, though abhorrent, revealed the danger of unsupervised cruelty and the vulnerability of the human voice to power. Philosophers and ethicists speculated that centuries of whispers had shaped notions of restraint and procedural oversight, that the fear of invisible methods of control had influenced laws aimed at protecting both body and speech. Yet even as reformers codified protections, the underlying lesson remained unaltered. Control through fear did not need spectacle. It needed subtlety, patience, and the appearance of normalcy. The best evil Erasmus's work suggested was never announced. It was executed in plain sight, cloaked as care, science, or order, and reinforced by the silences of those too afraid to speak. Across generations, Erasmus's philosophy lingered in the shadows of medicine, governance, and social hierarchy, appearing in moments where authority sought compliance without conflict, punishment without display, and order without acknowledgement. His legacy was a haunting, subtle architecture, a psychological scaffolding of terror built into the structures of obedience. Those who studied it, even unknowingly, encountered its echoes in hushed courtyards, in the erased histories of courtiers and patients, in the monuments that refused to speak their own truths. The whisper room, though bricked over and erased, had taught the world that horror need not roar. The most devastating acts of human cruelty arrived quietly, convincingly, and persistently, leaving traces that could be felt in the marrow, in the mind, and in the silence that followed, as if the world itself remembered Erasmus's hand in shaping terror. The voiceless became the enduring teachers, their absence a grim testament to methodical evil. And in every quiet corner of European history, in every experiment conducted under the guise of progress, in every hush that masked obedience, Erasmus's whisper lingered, instructing and reminding. The worst evil does not scream. It persuades, it conceals, it convinces the living that it exists for order, and in that deception it achieves immortality.